Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the education space, the education system in our country, the things that we need to kind of do to change that, and what we have progressed a bit in the past few years, but what we need to continue to do in the future. And when I say education industry, I don't typically mean the IGCSE, IB, because that's a slightly more new trend, something different, but I mean more traditional Indian system that we have. So I'm going to start with a conversation that I had with a friend the other day, maybe a couple of months ago. And this conversation really frustrated me. So it was a friend from college, and I was Skyping her, and I was just like, she asked me, she said, so who do you think is India's Mark Zuckerberg? Or who do you think is India's Steve Jobs? Or who do you think is India's Elon Musk? And it really irritated me that I had to struggle to find an answer. I had to struggle to figure out who was the person who was like innovative, who was the person who was upcoming, what have we done to revolutionize the world today? And that kind of got me thinking, okay, we need to do something soon and we need to do something fast. So in the last about 100 years or so, India hasn't been able to innovate as a country. We've struggled a little bit with invention. We've struggled a little bit with changing the way that people view the world. What we've done brilliantly is we've succeeded in the sciences. We've succeeded in mathematics. We've succeeded in corporate companies. But we're still extremely dependent on our past. We're extremely dependent on industrialists. We're extremely dependent on having the Ambanis and Tatas as our name, as what makes India famous as a country. So what's the answer? What do we need to do to really innovate? What do we really need to do? And I like to make this a little interactive, so anyone who has an answer for me? Any of the kids? You can just shout it out. Nothing? Can't do anything to innovate? Well, okay. So the answer is you. Yeah, you got one. Think out of the box, yeah. So that actually takes me to my point later. But the answer is actually you, the future generation. The future generation where 50% of our Indian population is below the age of 25. 65% of the Indian population is below the age of 35. That means literally the future of India depends on us. So we got to make a change and we got to do it really quickly. So I'm going to start with a little background on the Indian education system. So why has it been sort of backwards in some sense? So traditional Indian system is based on rote learning, memorization. That's kind of what we're bound by. We're restricted by rules and we're restricted to answer a question in a particular manner. Now what happens with rote learning, what happens with memorization is it sometimes curbs creativity. It curbs our ability to figure out what the best way to approach an answer may be. It curbs our ability to figure out, okay, is this really the right thing that we're looking at? Is this really the best way as we're considering it? And part of that is not necessarily how we're taught in school. It's more based on national exams. It's more based on state examinations that we have. So how many of you did do the ICSE system or are doing the ICSE system at some point in your life? Okay, so that's what I did, right? So I was an ICSE student. So as part of the ICSE system, we had to study Shakespeare. And Shakespeare was our final exam. And 9th grade, 10th grade, I studied Shakespeare. One book, Julius Caesar. I'll never forget it in my life, Friends, Romans, Countrymen. So that's the only thing that I studied for those 2 years when it came down to Julius Caesar. I went in for my ICSE exam. It was great. I did really well. The question said, okay, which act was this question from? Which scene was this from? Who said this to whom and why? What came after? What happened before that? And luckily, I knew the answers to those questions. Fast forward a few years. So I went to college and I took a Shakespeare class because I thought, okay, I'm great at Shakespeare. In the first day of class, they gave me 3 Shakespeare books to read in 1 month. And I said, wow, this is a challenge. So if that wasn't challenge enough, I had to write 3 papers on those 3 Shakespeare books in 1 month. That was an even bigger challenge that I had to face because those papers were nothing that I'd done before. It wasn't the style that I was taught. It wasn't the way that I was taught. It asked me to analyze. It asked me to figure out what the theme was. It asked me to figure out what the character is saying. Kind of what like you're doing in the IB now. So a little better prepared than I am for college, I can tell you that. But that's essentially what the traditional Indian system was. We focused a lot on rote learning. We focused a lot on memorization, and that's something that does need a lot of change. What I want to talk about is, in terms of traditional Indian system, in 10th grade, you're forced to choose a path. You're forced to choose whether you want to do a commerce stream, an arts stream, or a sciences stream. I don't think anyone in grade 10 necessarily needs to know the answer to that question. So if you are confused today as students, that's okay. You're not supposed to know exactly what you want to be when you grow up. In Anisha's case, she was lucky, but in most cases, that happens. You might be confused, you have options, you have potentials that you might want to consider. So why do we have to restrict ourselves to commerce, arts, and sciences? If you're doing commerce, you're only studying 5 commerce-related subjects. If you're doing arts, you're only studying the humanities. If you're doing science, you're only studying the sciences. And there's always that perception amongst general Indian population that, oh, he's doing science, he must be really smart. Or, oh, she's doing arts, what's she going to do with that? Well, the answer to the question is, the marks do not depend, well, intelligence doesn't depend on the marks you get. So your intelligence is not going to depend on getting a 95% in school. You may be a 95%er, you may be very intelligent, you may not be a 95%er, you may still be very, very intelligent. It just depends on finding the path that you want to take, being as creative and out of the box, we heard thinking out of the box, being as creative and out of the box as you can when you're approaching different things in life. Cut off by 1%, that does not make you a not smart, not intelligent person. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be studying at the best institution in India. The other problem is India has a sort of best and rest concept in terms of institutions where there are some really, really great places that you can study, but beyond that, there's sometimes a drop-off. Another thing that I feel like we need to, as a country, figure out how to keep pushing towards, and something I think we've already started doing in the past few years. So, how do we solve this problem? 2 big ways. One, government, which is a little bit hard for us to really solve personally. The second thing is a lot more doable. So from a government and education sector angle, it's rules and regulations. So the rules and regulations that they have, it's a very, very structured system that we're a part of. The national exams, the state exams, the entrance exams, everything depends on that. It's going to be really difficult for us to make that sort of change. But now that we're bound by these rules and regulations, we have to think out of the box in terms of how we're actually going to change the education system as students, as parents, as faculty in all different schools. So there's 2 big skill developments that I want to talk about. One, which is creativity, most important thing, and the second, which is communication skills. So when I talk about creativity, I want to first show a video, if I can manage to open it. दूसरा वीडियो के लिए ये So it's a 1-minute video where you guys can just do this activity along with the video. It'll give you a little bit of insight into yourselves.
यंत्रों पे चलने वाले रोबोट्स थे, वो बस एक ही था. यंत्रों पे चलने वाले रोबोट्स थे.
Sorry, technical trouble. But I'll tell you what the video is essentially. So I want you guys to all kind of clasp your hands, kind of like this. Yeah. So everyone's got their hands clasped. Okay. You'll notice that either your right thumb is on top or your left thumb is on top. Some of you will have your right thumb on top, some of you will have your left thumb on top. And one will be more natural than the other. So that's going to be your natural instinct. How many of you had your right thumb on top? A lot. How many of you had your left thumb on top? So I would say 60-40, probably around there. Do you think that gives you any insight into yourself? Probably not. So essentially, when it comes down to creativity, there are 2 concepts, the left brain and the right brain. So left brain is someone who is is a little bit more logical, more analytical in their thought process. And the right brain is someone who's a little bit more creative in their thought process. So if you had your right thumb clasped on top of your left thumb, you're more left-brained than right-brained. While that might tell you a little bit about yourself, it may not always be true, but for the most part, it tends to be. It's important to know that just because you have your left thumb clasped over your right thumb doesn't mean that you're going to be in a creative field. If you have your right thumb clasped on top of your left thumb, doesn't mean you're going to be in a more analytical field. the important thing when it comes down to innovation, the important thing when it comes down to figuring out how we can, as a country, can progress, is to kind of get our left brain and right brain in sync with each other. So how do we do that? So a lot of students come to me grade 8, grade 9, and as part of what I do with them is I try to train them to focus on their left and right brain development. So one simple thing that you can do at home is take a pen in your left hand and your right hand and just try and draw circles around it just to kind of get your hands synchronized in there. You will find that one hand leads the other, but as you practice more and more, you realize that the other one is slowly and steadily catching up as well. Second thing you can do if you're right-handed normally, you can brush your teeth with your left hand. Try doing these little tasks and automatically you'll see the more you do it, the more you'll find that your left and right brain eventually will be more in sync with each other. So that's innovation. That's what creativity really is, getting your left brain and right brain in sync with each other. That's the first thing. The second one, which I talk about, is communication skills. Now, when you're really creative, you might have an idea, you might come up with something revolutionary, you might want to portray it to someone else. As Indians, as a country, we typically are short on communication skills. So we typically lack strong communication skills. And when I say that, I mean written and verbal communication. So written communication is sort of when you want to present it in an essay format, or if you want to write a persuasive piece. The more important one, if you ask me, which is also verbal communication. So that's chutzpah, your ability to kind of go out there, your ability to sort of pitch an idea, your ability to kind of be confident even if you're talking absolute rubbish, right? It's a confidence that kind of comes with it. It's the confidence that comes in. So when I was in school, I was very comfortable talking to everyone in BIS because that was my family. But the minute I stepped out, I was a little bit insecure about talking in front of a group, never really enjoyed it, to be very honest, until I took a public speaking class in high school. So I did high school in the US, and I took a public speaking class. That was just me kind of pushing myself beyond my boundary and saying, okay, fine, this is something I know I might have to eventually do in the future. That public speaking class changed my life. Until today, while I am always nervous to go up on stage, I'm always excited as well. So it's more anxious rather than nervous in that sense. But persuasive communication, your ability to go up there, to talk to people, to pitch an idea, to sell an idea, to use creative ways to actually do that, to use ethos, to use pathos, to use logic, to use emotion, right? That's kind of what's going to help. That's what's going to sell in the future. So I was doing a little bit of research the other day, and I said, okay, so these are the skills we have to build. But then I also came across in my mind that ancient Indians were the best at innovation. So India came up with the number 0. India came up with the game Snakes and Ladders. India came up with the game Ludo. India came up with toilet flushes, random, I know. And India also had the first ever university. So what happened between then and now? Essentially, what we were able to do back in the day was we were able to create out of nothing. We were able to find different ways. We were the king of jugaad. We were able to do something out of nothing. We were able to excel at that. It's now time for us as a group of students, of parents, of teachers, of everyone to kind of push beyond our boundaries and do as much as we can for us to innovate and have the next Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Alisha. Questions for Alisha? Go ahead.
Good question. So when I went to college, I actually never thought I was going to do psychology. I thought I was going to do economics. And then I stumbled across psychology, and I sort of loved the medical side that you're talking about, right? I enjoyed studying that. I enjoyed learning about it. But in my mind, I knew it was something for me personally was very strenuous to kind of look at as a career. I then took a lot of classes in social psychology, in behavioral psychology, in adolescent psychology, And that's when I realized that I love talking to people, I love working with people, I love working with kids, and that I wanted to do something related to the field. And then I would say I kind of got lucky when it came down to me getting into education because I've managed to find that perfect bridge between something that I love to do and that also kind of required me to interact with a lot of people. So yeah, I think it worked out at the end of it, but I always knew that I preferred the social side. I felt like the clinical side was too much for me to handle, not that mentally strong.
Go ahead.
Does psychology have any emotional meaning?
Emotional?
Does psychology have any emotional meaning?
So when I think of psychology, honestly, I would say there's not one particular reason that I got into the field. There's not one thing that kind of struck a chord and said, okay, this is exactly what I want to study and this is exactly what I want to do. I just enjoyed the field as a whole. And the reason I enjoyed it is because it was so dynamic in nature, where I knew I was able to kind of keep a lot of options open and be really broad about it. So I wouldn't say it's the most emotional thing for me. I think right now, the most emotional thing and the one field that really is very, very close to me personally is education.
So you think that modern education system these days, especially in India, will possess creativity, and if you do, how did you going to Harvard or an Ivy League change that? How did it help build more on your creativity?
Sure. So I think with systems like IGCSE and IB, I think it does boost creativity a little bit more than the traditional Indian system. Um, I personally feel like the traditional Indian system can sometimes kill creativity because there's only one way of learning, there's only one right and one wrong, right? So we start to think very convergently and not very divergently. So when you're thinking 2 plus 2 is equal to, there's one answer, it's 4. But when you approach a question very differently, where you say x plus x is equal to 4, there are multiple possibilities, right? So that's what divergent thinking really is. It's a matter of kind of stepping out of the box and having multiple possibilities in that sense. When I actually went to high school in the U.S., so my mind started changing a lot more at that stage, where I realized that everything that I did was more analytical. I had to actually understand a concept really, really well to put it on paper, sort of what you do in the IGCSE and the IB. And at the same time, a lot of it was more practical. So everything I did, I needed to figure out how to implement in real life, right? So if it's a theory that I'm learning, I needed to go and do an experiment to figure out how it's actually going to play out in real life. So I think, yeah, traditional Indian system, and to be honest, there's a study that says schooling in general does curb creativity, but I won't go so far to say that. I would say traditional Indian system did curb the creativity bit a little.
Alisha, you spoke of the difficulty of getting the government-led education sector to turn around. Do you see more hope in the new private universities that have come up? Should our students be who want to be creative be considering them?
Absolutely. I think there is a change that's slow and steady. I think a lot of private universities that are coming up are ones that understand this concept of thinking out of the box, understand this concept of creativity, get the idea, sort of what the liberal arts education really is. So I do see a lot of change happening in the next maybe 10 years. It would take a little while. But the one problem that I still foresee is sometimes faculty, which is still the training that is required to teach a curriculum like that.
Last question.
You said that you didn't talk about the schooling in the US. So what do you feel is the difference between schooling there and how it affected you?
So when I compare the two schoolings, I compare it to the ICSE system and the US curriculum, right? The biggest difference that I found was, well, there are two big differences. One, which was, again, like I said, thinking out of the box, analytical approach, creativity. The second one, where I wasn't bound to taking only certain subjects. So, for example, I was really, really passionate about bio. I was also really passionate about psychology. I hated math. And I was really passionate about English, right? I wanted to take on a new language. And that kind of system actually encouraged me to be able to take all of those subjects without really dropping out any of my passions that I had over there. So, kind of not restricting me to a commerce, arts, or science field, but giving me the ability to mix and match them all. Thanks, guys, and congratulations on the Harvard admit.